Hi there, parents. Well, welcome to session 2 of this Talking to Your Teen About Money course. Now, in the last session, we looked at expenses, and I'm hoping you've had a chance to sit down with your teen and talk to them about all the sorts of household expenses that there are and how much each of those expenses cost. No doubt that will be a real eye-opener for them. Now, starting with expenses was very deliberate because we need to understand our expenses before we can put together a realistic budget. And that's what we're talking about in this session. We need to start talking to our kids about budgeting and teaching them how to manage money. There's 3 reasons why we need to do this. Firstly, having a budget is the key to being able to consistently spend less than we earn, which is how we stay out of debt. The second reason is from all the surveys that we've got kids to fill in over the years, their number one fear in relation to money is not having enough money to pay the bills and being able to have some fun at the same time. So they want to be able to pay the bills and they want to still be able to have a bit of fun, but they just don't know how they're going to be able to do all of that. And having a budget is really key to that happening. The third reason, and again it comes back to the surveys, is when we ask kids, and this is one question we have on all our surveys, is what are 3 things you would really like your mum and dad to teach you about money? Without any doubt, the number one thing they want to learn from you is how to budget. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to teach you the system that my grandma taught me when I was a teenager about 25 to 30 years ago. So very basic system. Grandma literally had physical glass jars in her kitchen cupboard. She went around to the post office every payday, she got her pay, she came home with her pay and took down the glass jars from the kitchen cupboard. Grandma had 5 jars that pretty much covered all of her expenses back then. So you can see here we've got a gas jar, electricity, milkman, housekeeping, and then over here we've got the rates. Now, Grandma, the first thing she did was she took her pay and she would then top up each of these jars. So let's just say, to keep this really practical, let's say I have $800 here in Monopoly money. $800 was my income. What would then happen, or Grandma's income? What would then happen is Grandma would put $60 into the gas jar. From that $800, she would put $90 into the electricity jar. She would put $10 into the milkman jar. $433 for the housekeeping. So that was the more discretionary expenses associated with running a house, like clothes, groceries, petrol, and so on. $433, and then she would put $80 into the gas jar. From her $800, she would then have $127 left over, which was pure savings. She knew that she had all her expenses covered, so this money was truly savings, so she could pop that in the bank the next day, knowing that she wasn't going to have to pull it out to cover some other expenses that were coming up. So that's the very basics of budgeting. Now, what would then happen is during that particular month, some of these expenses would all be spent. So for instance, each month, typically Grandma would spend all of her housekeeping money. She would also pay the milkman every month, so that jar would be empty, but the other jars would be left to accumulate. So with the gas jar, that was a quarterly bill, so Grandma, again, she'd go around for payday, select her $800, put, what have we got there, $60 of that into the gas jar. She would then go $90 into the electricity jar. She would put another $10 into the milkman jar, another $433 into the housekeeping jar, and another $80 into the gas jar. So, and then at the end of that, of course, she would have another $127 left over, which she should go and put into the bank, again, as true savings. The key here is that what doesn't get spent accumulates. Now, some jars will be empty every month after we've spent the money for the month. Other jars will accumulate. So, for instance, the gas and the electricity would go for 3 months and then the money would be taken out. The rates would go for 12 months and then the money would be taken out. The key principles here, though, were Grandma knew exactly what all of her expenses were. That's number one. Number two, she knew how much she needed to put aside for each expense. each payday so that when that money turned up, she had the bills covered. When the bills turned up, she had the money there to cover them. The third thing was that Grandma knew that her $800 was enough to cover all of her expenses. So she figured it all out. She knew she could cover all the bills. The discretionary ones she could adjust according to how much money she had. But once she put money aside, she knew she had them all covered. She had enough money, and she still had $127 left. So she was consistently living within her means. What would then happen is the fourth principle was that what wasn't spent one month would accumulate in the jar for future months. And so, for instance, these days with car registration, we could put aside 1/12 of it so that when that bill turned up, in 12 months' time, the money was sitting there ready to pay it. So that was the fourth principle. What doesn't get spent accumulates. Fifth principle was you can't spend more than you've got in your jars. That's all you've got. When it runs out, bad luck, you've got to make do. And the last principle, very simple, the sixth principle was you can't take out one full jar to top up an empty jar, because otherwise we wouldn't have enough to pay the bills when they turn up. So there we go, 6 really simple principles for how we should budget. Can I encourage you to take the time to teach your kids some very basic principles for budgeting? Now, you don't need to use glass jars. You can use envelopes. You can use a paper version of a budget. These days we have apps, and certainly we've got a budget app, a Grandma's Jars budget app, which is based exactly on these principles that I learnt with Grandma, and I've just evolved it over time. If, just so you know, if you don't feel up to teaching your kids this yourself, I do run budgeting classes for teenagers where we actually use the Grandma's Jars app. We get them all set up, and we then keep them accountable for sticking to it. So if that's something you think you need a bit of help with, then you can certainly hire that part of the process off to us. But very important, please start equipping your kids with the skills to manage their money well so that they can consistently save money every single month and steer well clear of consumer debt.